Hi everyone, I am Rahul and this is HOA Case Lab, sharing powerful HOA cases full of drama and revenge. Every neighborhood has that one quiet house that nobody notices until something goes wrong. In this story, that house was mine. I had just moved in, thinking I found the perfect place to settle down. Clean streets, tidy lawns, predictable routines, and the kind of community that looks peaceful on the surface. But what I didn't realize was that peace can be an illusion when control becomes more important than common sense. Every morning at exactly the same time, a line of cars began cutting across my front lawn like it was a shortcut designed by nature itself. Tires carved paths through the grass. Mud replaced soil. The damage wasn't random, it was deliberate. Convenience? Bro, hearing this situation unfold in real life would have blown anyone's mind. It felt unreal, like something you'd expect in a dramatic online story, not in your own front yard. That's exactly how people act when they believe rules apply to everyone except them. And what made it worse was the silence. No apologies, no acknowledgement, just repetition, day after day. I tried being patient. I tried reasoning with myself, but patience has limits, and mine was about to run out in a way nobody saw coming. The first few mornings felt like accidents. I told myself that maybe someone was late for work, maybe a delivery driver misjudged the driveway, maybe a guest didn't realize where the property line was. That's what reasonable people do. They assume misunderstanding before malice. But when the same tire tracks reappeared in the exact same pattern every single day, it stopped feeling accidental and started feeling intentional. The lawn wasn't just being crossed, it was being used. My front yard had effectively become a private shortcut for several households in the neighborhood. Connecting the main street to a side road behind the homes, instead of driving the longer legal route, people were cutting straight across my grass at dawn when traffic was slightly heavier. It shaved maybe 30 seconds off their commute, but it was costing me time, money, and pride. At first, I tried soft solutions. I placed small, decorative rocks near the edge of the lawn. The next morning, they were carefully moved aside. I installed temporary garden edging. Within 2 days, the tires had flattened it down. I even tried polite signs, the kind that say, "Please stay off the grass." They weren't vandalized, but they were ignored. The tracks kept forming. It wasn't just one vehicle. It was multiple. A routine, a system. And the more consistent it became, the clearer the message felt. My property was convenient. And that was all that mattered. Bro, this is the part where most people would lose it immediately. Because nothing tests your patience like repeated disrespect disguised as convenience. And what really hit me was the normalization of it. When I stepped outside one morning, I noticed the driver slow down slightly as they crossed, almost casually, as if it were a designated road. No eye contact, no hesitation, just routine. That moment changed something inside me. It wasn't about grass anymore. It was about boundaries. If people could turn my front yard into their unofficial roadway without consequence, what would stop them from deciding something else belonged to them next? I began researching property rights and local ordinances. I learned that while informal shortcuts happen in neighborhoods, continuous trespassing can become a civil matter if ignored. I also discovered something interesting. Homeowners are generally allowed to protect their property using reasonable measures as long as those measures aren't designed to harm unlawfully. That word, reasonable, became important. I wasn't looking to damage anyone. I wasn't trying to escalate, but I wanted the crossing to stop permanently. Around this time, I also noticed subtle signs that the behavior wasn't limited to random drivers. The wear pattern suggested consistent timing. Early morning, same window. That meant this wasn't chaos, it was habit. Habits can be powerful, they can also be predictable. And predictability is the foundation of strategy. I considered contacting the local authorities, but I hesitated. Reporting minor trespassing can sometimes create tension in tight communities, and I didn't want to become that neighbor. But the reality was, I had already been assigned that role without consent. My lawn was turning brown in strips. Rain made it worse, carving muddy grooves that deepened over time. It was starting to affect drainage. It wasn't just cosmetic anymore, it was structural damage. That's when I decided to observe carefully before acting. For 1 week, I woke up earlier than usual and watched from inside my home. I documented times, I noted vehicle types, I confirmed that the behavior happened even when traffic wasn't heavy. This wasn't necessity, it was preference. And that's what made it worse, because preference implies choice. 4. What surprised me most was how quickly I felt the emotional shift from irritation to resolve. Not anger, not revenge. Resolve. There's a difference. Anger burns fast. Resolve builds quietly. I realized that whatever solution I chose needed to be effective enough to send a clear message, but subtle enough to avoid unnecessary drama. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted permanence. So I started thinking creatively. What stops a vehicle without creating danger? What discourages crossing without causing harm? How do you design boundaries that are visible enough to prevent entry, but not aggressive enough to cause injury? That question consumed my evenings. I sketched ideas. I researched landscaping techniques used in commercial spaces to deter unauthorized access. I studied property protection strategies that complied with local safety standards, and slowly a plan formed. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It didn't require confrontation. It required preparation. If people believed the lawn was an open shortcut, I would transform it into something that clearly wasn't. The key was timing, because I knew exactly when the crossings occurred. That gave me an advantage. An advantage, when used responsibly, becomes protection. And by the end of the week, I was no longer just observing. I was building a solution in my mind, something structured, something intentional, something that would make the shortcut physically impossible without causing calm. And once the idea settled, I felt calm for the first time in days. But implementing it would require precision, because in situations like this, one wrong move can turn defense into conflict. And I was about to take the next step. 5. Once the decision was made, everything shifted from emotional frustration to calculated planning. I stopped reacting and started designing. The goal was no longer to complain about the crossings. It was to permanently remove the possibility of crossing. But I had to do it in a way that stayed within legal boundaries and avoided creating danger. That part mattered more than anything. I didn't want drama. I wanted results. I began by studying landscaping methods used in commercial properties to prevent vehicle intrusion. Businesses often use physical barriers, not to punish, but to guide movement. Subtle reinforcement beneath the surface can discourage entry without looking aggressive. That idea stayed with me. If people believed the lawn was soft and open, then the solution had to change that perception entirely. Bro, this is where it got interesting. Because most people think revenge means confrontation, but real strategy, it's quiet, it's structural, it's about changing the environment so behavior changes automatically. That's exactly how people act in real life when they feel entitled. They only stop when the environment forces clarity. I started with visible improvements first. I reinforced the lawn edges with deeper edging materials designed to prevent collapse under pressure. I consulted local building guidelines to ensure everything remained compliant. I wasn't installing anything dangerous. I was strengthening my property's perimeter. The work took several days. Each evening I measured carefully. Each morning I observed the results. During this time, the crossings continued. Tires still cut across the grass, but now I noticed subtle differences. The tracks were slightly shallower in some areas, likely due to the earlier reinforcement. That confirms something important. The lawn could be transformed without drawing attention. 6. But reinforcement alone wouldn't solve the problem. It would only slow it down. So I expanded the plan. I researched underground deterrent systems used in agricultural and private land management. Many of these solutions rely on hidden structural elements that discourage heavy pressure. The key was subtlety. Nothing above the surface could appear threatening. Everything had to blend naturally into the yard. That's when the idea of hidden barriers became central. I mapped the exact path vehicles were taking. The tire marks were consistent, forming a diagonal pattern from the street corner to the rear access road. That predictability made it easier to design a response. Instead of covering the entire yard, I focused only on the crossing corridor. I installed reinforced underground edging along that path. The materials were designed to maintain soil integrity while preventing compression beyond a safe threshold. From the surface, it still looked like normal grass. No warning signs, no spikes, no hazards, just a lawn that felt unchanged visually. The transformation took careful effort. I worked in sections to avoid drawing attention. Neighbors occasionally walked by, but no one questioned routine landscaping improvements. People renovate their yards all the time. That's what made it perfect. It didn't look like retaliation, it looked like maintenance. But I didn't stop there. To ensure clarity, I added subtle landscaping elements that indicated the area was not intended for traffic. Low decorative shrubs were placed strategically along the edge of the reinforced path. Not tall enough to obstruct visibility, just enough to signal boundary reinforcement. Combined with the underground structure, it created a layered deterrent. When I stepped back after completing the installation, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control, not over other people, over my own space. And then came the test. 7 the next morning, I watched from inside again. I wanted to see if the behavior would change. The first vehicle approached at the usual time. It slowed slightly, just like before. Then it began crossing. The front tires rolled onto the reinforced corridor. For a split second, everything seemed normal. Then the vehicle hesitated, not because of damage, but because of resistance. The structural reinforcement beneath the surface created a subtle unevenness in compression. The driver adjusted slightly, reduced speed, and completed the crossing more cautiously than before. That moment confirmed the effectiveness of the system. It didn't stop the vehicle abruptly, it discouraged the shortcut naturally. The second vehicle arrived minutes later. Same result, slow entry, increased caution, no smooth glide across the lawn. The shortcut was no longer convenient. It required attention, and attention disrupts habit. By the end of that morning, something had changed. The pattern wasn't as casual. Drivers began adjusting their routes slightly, perhaps noticing the difference in terrain. The lawn was no longer acting like a roadway. It felt structured. Bro, this was the turning point because when convenience disappears, behavior shifts fast. But I knew escalation might follow. When people lose easy access, they sometimes react emotionally. So I prepared mentally for possible confrontation. I reviewed local regulations again to ensure everything I installed was compliant. The reinforcement was within property standards. No harm, no traps, just structure. The lawn was now resilient, and the shortcuts were about to face consequences. The real reaction was coming. 8. The change didn't happen overnight, but it became obvious within days. The morning crossings grew hesitant, and hesitation is the first crack in a habit that once felt untouchable. Drivers slowed more than usual, as if sensing something was different beneath the surface. The lawn still looked like a lawn, but the smoothness they depended on was gone. What used to feel like an effortless shortcut now required caution. And caution, in the world of convenience, feels like resistance. One morning, a vehicle approached at the usual time. I watched from inside, calm and steady. The tires rolled onto the reinforced corridor, but this time the driver immediately reduced speed further, almost stopping before fully committing. The subtle underground structure was doing exactly what it was designed to do, discouraging repeated pressure without causing harm. There was no damage, no confrontation, just a clear signal that this path was no longer optimized for travel. And that was the real revenge. Not destruction, not chaos, just transformation. By changing the physical environment, I changed behavior. The shortcut was no longer attractive, it was no longer smooth, and it no longer rewarded impatience. People began reconsidering. Some vehicles stopped crossing entirely. Others attempted once more, then chose the street route instead. The lawn slowly reclaimed its identity as a yard rather than an unofficial road. Bro, this was the moment everything felt balanced. No shouting, no drama, just results. The system worked because it was designed carefully and implemented responsibly. The hidden barriers did not punish anyone, they simply restored boundaries. And in situations like this, boundaries are everything. For the first time since moving in, my mornings were quiet. No tire tracks, no muddy grooves, just grass beginning to recover under consistent care. The relief wasn't loud, but it was powerful. The lawn was healing, and the shortcut culture was fading away. 9. After the shortcut stopped, the neighborhood felt different in a way that was almost hard to describe. It wasn't dramatic. There were no public arguments, no emergency visits, no loud confrontations. Instead, there was a quiet adjustment in behavior that spread naturally once the shortcut no longer worked the way it used to. People adapted. That's what humans do. When convenience disappears, patterns shift. I noticed the lawn beginning to recover. The damaged strips slowly blended back into the rest of the yard as I continued regular maintenance. Fresh growth replaced the worn paths. The soil, no longer compressed daily, regained its structure. What had once been a visible diagonal scar across the property started to fade. It wasn't instant peeling, but it was steady. And steady progress feels satisfying in a way that sudden action never does. The morning traffic continued as usual, but the diagonal movement across my yard had largely stopped. Drivers seemed to prefer the intended roads now. Whether it was the subtle resistance beneath the surface, or simply the realization that the lawn was no longer smooth terrain, the shortcut culture dissolved without any public announcement. There was no need for one. The environment had already spoken clearly. Bro, this is the part that really hits different, because most drama stories build towards shouting matches or dramatic revenge scenes. But sometimes the most powerful move is quiet structure. When you design your response carefully, you don't need to argue, you don't need to convince anyone, you simply change the conditions. I also took time to reflect on the bigger picture, and this wasn't just about grass, it was about respect for boundaries. Once someone crosses a line repeatedly, it stops being an accident and becomes a habit. And habits only end when something interrupts them consistently. The hidden reinforcement did exactly that. It didn't attack anyone, it didn't cause harm, it simply removed the advantage. So, over the following weeks, I noticed fewer vehicles even approaching the lawn's edge. The pattern had been broken. That diagonal route was no longer part of anyone's routine. And because it no longer offered smooth passage, it gradually disappeared from collective memory. Neighbors continued their lives as usual. There were no visible tensions. If anyone noticed the improvements to the yard, they likely saw it as normal landscaping. That was important to me. The goal was never attention. It was resolution. The lawn became something I felt proud of again, not because it was perfect, but because it represented a boundary that had been restored. The grass grew evenly, the soil stabilized, and the front yard returned to being a front yard instead of a shortcut corridor. And in that quiet recovery, I realized something valuable. Sometimes you don't need to win loudly. You just need to design wisely. The environment had changed, and because it changed, the behavior changed too. Months passed, and the story that once felt like a daily battle slowly became a distant memory. The hidden reinforcement remained in place, quietly doing its job without drawing attention. There were no incidents, no complaints, and no return of the diagonal tire tracks that once carved across the lawn every morning. The shortcut had fully disappeared, replaced by the normal flow of traffic along the designated roads. And that shift didn't come from confrontation, it came from consistency. What surprised me most wasn't that the plan worked, it was how naturally it worked. People adapt quickly when convenience changes. When the environment no longer supports a habit, the habit fades. That's not drama, that's psychology. And honestly, bro, hearing that realization settle in was more satisfying than any argument could have been, because it proves something important. You don't have to escalate to be effective. Sometimes you just have to redesign the system. 11. The lawn continued to recover, season by season. The soil regained strength. The grass grew evenly without pressure, compacting it every morning, and what used to feel like damage became part of the property's history, not its present. And that distinction mattered. The difference between being used and being respected is often invisible, but you feel it in everyday life. I never needed to announce anything. There were no dramatic reveals, no public explanations. The change spoke for itself. The shortcut ended because it was no longer practical. And when convenience disappears, behavior follows. That's exactly how situations like this tend to resolve in real life. Not with fireworks, but with structure. Not with revenge for the sake of revenge, but with boundaries that are impossible to ignore. The lesson wasn't about barriers or landscaping. It was about ownership, of space, of decisions, and of how far you're willing to let things go before taking calm, calculated action. Looking back, I don't see a villain story, I see a boundary story. And sometimes that's the difference between chaos and control. And that was the end of the shortcuts. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more true style HOA, pro revenge, and malicious compliance narrations. These kinds of real life boundary battles happen more often than people think. And every story shows how patience, strategy, and smart thinking can completely change the outcome without unnecessary drama. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. Would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have chosen a different approach? I read through your feedback and it helps shape future stories. If you've ever dealt with neighbors who crossed a line, literal or figurative, share your experience in the comments. Stories like yours might inspire the next episode. And if you want more narrations like this, so check out the next video on the screen right now